When you think the words platforming mascots, usually three characters come to mind immediately. Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Crash Bandicoot. The third of which will be the focus of today's episode of Here's Why. When discussing the PlayStation 1, there are a couple of games that always come to mind, and Crash Bandicoot is one of them. The original trilogy is synonymous with the console, and while today Crash can be seen on every major console, back in the day he was something of a makeshift mascot for the PlayStation, and it worked. A lot of people brought the PS1 solely to play this fancy new 3D platforming game. And while this game came out in 1996, before I was born, it was still a massive part of my childhood. In fact, Crash Bandicoot was one of the first games I had ever played outside of VTech and Leapfrog educational games. It was Crash 1, Pac-Man World, and Tarzan on PS1 that I would play on my grandparents' PS2 all the time whenever I visited. I could never get past the third level of Crash though. I must have been around 4 or 5 years old at the time. It's thanks to these games that I would even become interested in video games to begin with, even if I never actually owned the games myself. This game is what put Naughty Dog on the map. They had released somewhat successful games before this, but nothing compared to what this game achieved. And now look at them today, making some of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, with Uncharted and The Last of Us. This game also did a lot to make PlayStation a legit rival to Nintendo and Sega. In fact, the whole reason Sony even made the PlayStation to begin with is because Nintendo turned them down when creating a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, which would be known as the Nintendo PlayStation. But Nintendo opted to partner with Philips for the CDI instead. Nintendo literally created one of their biggest rivals, and Crash Bandicoot helped them reach their popularity. Wild. At the time of the game's release, Crash 1 was regarded as a super high quality game. The game's graphics were far superior to what the N64 was showing off at the time, and the sound quality was amazing. The sound effects from this game are some of the most nostalgic for me personally. The sound that plays whenever spinning an enemy is still satisfying to this day. Now, playing this game in the modern age, most aspects of the game haven't aged too gracefully, but the gameplay is still pretty good. The controls are really simple. All Crash can do is move, jump, and spin. That's it. There's no slide, there's no crouching, no bazookas, nothing like that. This makes the game really beginner friendly. Despite its 3D visuals, it doesn't play like a traditional 3D platformer like Mario 64 does. Crash plays like a 2D platformer where the camera is positioned behind Crash. This is why the game was called Sonic's ass game during development. 3 words that can be used to describe most modern Sonic games. How about that? The goal of each level is to simply reach the end. However, an optional objective is to destroy every crate in the level to earn a gem at the end. You can destroy crates by jumping on them or spinning them. Same goes for the enemies, well, most of them. There are also these TNT crates that explode after 3 seconds when jumping on them. This may sound simple, but this game is punishing in its difficulty, because you are not allowed to die if you want the gem. You must beat the level perfectly. This is because if you hit a checkpoint crate and then die, all of the crates before the checkpoint would all respawn. But even backtracking to collect them all again doesn't make the gem appear. Your only way to get the gem is to beat the level in one fell swoop. The gems are a good incentive for completion on concept if you ask me, since they can unlock new endings and sometimes even whole new levels. But this game makes getting gems too difficult in my opinion, and stops me from ever trying to get them all. And this game is not easy, even when not going for completion. You will die a lot. In fact, Crash dies on one hit, unless you have collected an Aku Aku mask that allows Crash to have 1 extra hit point each, and the third one gives you brief invincibility and a slight speed boost. Which reminds me, has Aku Aku ever really been explained? We know he's a witch doctor mask, but why is he even helping Crash to begin with, and how do his powers work? All of the game's main mechanics are all immediately introduced in the first level. The game doesn't outright tell you how to play, you learn by beating this first level. Now Crash feels pretty good to control, but compared to its sequels, man, Crash is so stiff in this game. And to be honest, it feels kind of clunky, but you should get the hang of it in no time. I think this is due to Crash 1 being released before the advent of the DualShock controllers, meaning it was designed with the D-pad in mind. There is also one extra gameplay style that shows up very briefly, that being the hog riding level, where you cannot stop moving and must dodge oncoming obstacles in time to not crash and die. Honestly, a really fun gimmick that will continue to show up from time to time in the series. The platforming levels are pretty varied too, often switching from 2D to 3D with some levels where Crash faces the camera whilst running away from a boulder. This is so iconic, so much so that they put it on the box art. The worst part about the levels is when some of them make you backtrack, often due to a fork in the road. The camera does not accommodate for this, meaning you better get the level layout memorized, or you will probably die. This is a problem with all three of the classic games. I can't believe they never did anything to fix this problem. Another issue is with the TNT boxes if you go for completion, because you need to guarantee that these boxes explode, because if you're too far away they stop rendering, and therefore don't explode boxes that are nearby, which means they're not added to your box tally. Being told that you've only missed a few boxes because some TNT didn't explode properly is utterly soul-crushing. Luckily, however, you shouldn't see too many game overs in this game, since they love to throw extra lives at you every 2 minutes. Be careful though, because Crash can spin extra lives away. You'll still see plenty of deaths though, there's no doubt about that. In fact, Crash has so many unique death animations in this game, at least for a PS1 launch game. From gruesome to just plain funny. This is what Crash did better than Mario in my opinion, just having a fun personality. One of the main sources of deaths I've experienced is the depth perception in certain levels, as it can be pretty tricky to see where you're going to land from time to time, which leads to much frustration. Mainly in these dark cave-like ruin levels which are full of bottomless pits. This game loves bottomless pits, by the way. The story for this game is fairly minuscule. To put it simply, an evil scientist named Dr. Neo-Cortex and his henchman Nitrous Brio have been experimenting on the local wildlife to build an army to take over the world. However, when it came to experiments on 2 bandicoots, it all goes wrong, as the male bandicoot escapes through the window, and a female bandicoot named Torna, who I guess is Crash's implied girlfriend, however is not so lucky, and now Crash must find his way back up to the castle to rescue her. That's about it. The story was never what Crash was all about, so a simple narrative is fine in my books. Cortex, however, is not a very threatening villain in the least. In this game, his voice is even weird too. This is the only game where Cortex sounds like this, and he later received his iconic voice by Clancy Brown in the next game. Same can be said for most of the bosses. They aren't very challenging or scary in the least. Let's go through them quickly. Papu Papu is a joke. He can be defeated in seconds, and you actually need to seriously try to mess up if you want a challenge. Then there is Ripperoo, who is just boring. Then Koala Kong, who I actually kind of like. His boss fight is unique, but still mind-numbingly easy. Then Pinstripe. For a boss in a kids game that wields a Tommy gun, he is disappointingly weak. And this might be where they found the inspiration for Uncharted with all this cover-based shooting going on. Embryo is fun in concept and design, but the fight is still really pathetic. And then Cortex. This might be the best Cortex fight in the series. Definitely the hardest, but still not nearly as hard as some of the levels before this. In fact, if you have collected every single gem in the game, you can outright skip the final boss and find a secret ending, with Crash and Torna flying away peacefully. Even though it's all a futile effort because Torna ends up dating Pinstripe of all people anyway. And yes, that's canon. Speaking of Torna, most levels have 3 Torna tokens that when collected transport you to a bonus stage that are only important for saving, since for some reason in this game you can only save when collecting a gem or beating a bonus level. Or you could use the password, but again, for some reason they are unbelievably long and tedious to enter. Oh, and the boxes in the bonus area don't count towards your total, so they are completely pointless. Unless it is a Cortex bonus stage, they give you a key to unlock new levels when completed. Visually, the game actually still looks pretty good in my opinion. At least the textures in the environments do. This Crash model isn't terrible, and is really expressive for the time, but it just looks off. I can't really describe it. It just looks too blocky and kind of doofy. One of my favourite aspects of the levels is how the game slowly transitions from beach and jungle levels to dark, dreary, mechanical and industrial levels as you get closer and closer to Cortex Castle. This tiny detail really makes you feel like you're progressing. And so does the world map. This is the only game from the originals to have a world map spanning across 3 islands, rather than a single warp room. However, getting from one end of the map to the other can be kind of slow. The music is really good too. Instead of upbeat, catchy tracks, they chose to use more atmospheric and moody tracks, and it works really well. Slippery Climb and Cortex's theme being my personal favourites from this game. And the main theme is immediately recognisable. It's catchy and captures the spirit of Crash Bandicoot really well. This game has some impressive lighting too, with a level all about platforming in the dark with Aku Aku acting as a flashlight that slowly wears out unless you collect more masks. Good stuff. 25 years later, Crash 1 is still a pretty good time with solid level design and visually still holds up today, to a certain extent. But with it being the first in the franchise, it has a number of issues, from the baffling saving mechanics to completion being anticlimactic and ultimately pointless. Luckily, it got an amazing sequel only 1 year later, and a superb remake in 2017, that for the most part fixes most of the issues I've had. For anyone who's interested in retro gaming or platformers, I'd recommend to at least beat this game. It's a solid game for its time. Be prepared for a rough time if you're a completionist though. And with all that being said, thank you for watching Here's Why.